Hello, you're watching the Great Canadian Bagel here, and today we have the 2024 Nova Scotian election post-mortem. Now, before I begin, I'd like to remind all my lovely viewers that my last video is planned for December 12th this year. And then I will be taking a break until sometime early in January, probably January 6th, but we will see. And before we begin, I'd also like to shout out the channel members. I really appreciate the support you guys give the channel. You really make this a lot easier for me to be doing and more viable as a practice. And if you guys want to support the work I do here, by all means, go and link in the description below and press that join button. But otherwise, like, share, subscribe, and comment below. With that, let us begin. So what I have here is the map from Wikipedia for the actual election result. Now, pretty self-explanatory, pretty straightforward. This is what my final published forecast was like. I did pretty good overall on seats. The only two I missed was Sackville-Cobequid and Timberley Prospect. Some of the ones I got the margins slightly off, like Sackville-Uniacke, but that happens. Things move around and stuff. Now, the two misses I had are pretty much down entirely to local effects in this forecast. So, in Sackville-Cobequid, the PCs, I don't know why I didn't update this or factor this in the model. I could have done this, I just didn't. I don't know, forgot about it. But the PC's candidate that won last time was not running this time again, and I had updated that, but that incumbent, or that candidate, was actually quite a good candidate, and they replaced that guy with a much weaker candidate. And the NDP ran a relatively strong candidate there compared to the Liberals or the PCs. So that really just kind of came down to the PCs ran someone who wasn't particularly popular in the region, and the NDP ran someone who was. And my model was kind of still thinking that this person was more like the last PC candidate, but that last PC candidate probably overperformed where the PCs should have been anyways, because he was a slightly better than average candidate. So that's kind of how that happens. And that's why no matter what happens, I will never get 100% hit rates on average in modeling like this. I generally aim for 90-95%. Because, yes, if I have the time and resources, I could look into all of the writings and catch little things like this. I don't. If you want to make it so that's easy for me to do it, then go in the link in the description below and press the join button. But until I have enough money to pay people to help research for my channel, I don't have the resources to do that. It's just not a plausible thing for me to do. So I'm going to get misses like that. And then the other one was Timberley Prospect. Now, this one actually caught me completely off guard. In hindsight, it makes sense, but completely off guard. I didn't realize how popular Ian Rankin was in the region. I should have. I know people from the area. I could have talked to them. I just didn't think to do it. But yeah, he's actually quite popular in Timberley Prospect, and so popular to the fact he gained net vote share from 2021, while the rest of the Liberal Party lost 14 or like 15 points province-wide. So, oops. But considering that those two things, those two seat misses, are in my final published model, are entirely local effects and nothing else, I'm pretty content. It's not methodological error. It's not consistent across the board. It's just two parts or two writings that had very local effects that threw off the math. Now, let us go and compare the post-mortem. So we're going to go first with poll comparisons, because I obviously did a poll in this election. So here is the ranking of all the polls. MQO did the best. Then we have Liaison. I'm skipping myself for now. Then Main Street, Cardinal, Abacus, Forum. Now, Abacus was published, I believe, the furthest from actual election day. Let me double check this. Would I have this set up prepped? Nope. Why would I do that? Actually, no. They were not the furthest, so that's just a miss from Abacus. And an unfortunate miss from Forum, but it happens. Narrative is definitely the one that was actually pulled furthest from election day, other than myself. Now, for myself, I have myself listed here 3 times. So this one is the one I actually published on my Substack, the one I talked about on my channel. This is the one you are perfectly free to grade me on, because that is the one I officially published. And that was not a very good poll. Now, in my defense, my field dates were early October to early November, so quite before election day. But I don't think that actually matters, especially for this election. So there's 2 things that happened with my polling here. The first one, as you'll notice, I have published corrected line here. I actually had a math mistake. I have no one checking my work. It's literally just myself. I did the math wrong, and I miscounted NDP to Liberal defectors and overcounted Liberal to NDP defectors in how I was doing the math. So corrected, it's actually supposed to be 22 Liberal, 25 NDP, and we'll go into the regionals momentarily. And if I had that correction in, my poll's a lot better. It's now middle of the road again. Perfectly acceptable. But I'm perfectly fine if you don't want to give me credit for that one. I published one that had the math done wrong. That's my bad. It happens. I could explain what I did exactly wrong, but I don't want to, because that would also reveal my actual methods, and I don't want to do that. I'm not going to tell the internet how I actually do weighting, because I think that is a trade secret. And now the other one here, I have this unpublished one. So in this particular election, I did an experiment. And the published one was the published version of the experiment because, and this is a perfectly reasonable thing, you can judge me on the published one. I'm not saying you should judge me on the unpublished one. This is just me, in full disclosure, talking about what I did as a pollster. Now, I've only polled 3 well, technically, I guess you could say 4 elections. I technically polled in New Brunswick. The sample size was too small to bother publishing them. That have actually had an election result yet. So I was doing an experiment with this one. And the experiment was I was running... Normally, I recruit people to my online panel through my videos, through Twitter, through natural reach. And in this particular election, with the published results, I also did something where I ran internet ads. Paid ads to increase the reach of my polling. Now, the reason why I don't normally do that, one, is it costs money. But actually, internet ads are pretty cheap, so that's not, in hindsight, that's not a really big concern. But the other big reason I don't normally do that is part of my theory of polling is I actually want to try to poll politically engaged people, not unpolitically engaged people. And it turns out, in my theory, is that people who actually watch my YouTube channel or they read my Twitter or anyone else or any of the followers of mine or acquaintances of mine on Twitter who retweet me, that sphere of people are very politically engaged and are actually more useful to poll than randoms. And ads are going to get more random people than that recruitment methodology. Similarly, if I were to call people or whatever, it's going to be a similar idea. That's my theory, or part of my theory on how I do my polling. Here I did the experiment where I tried to add more quote-unquote random people to the audience by doing this. Now, what I have here, is this the correct one? Yes, this is the correct one. So, this is the actual raw Excel sheet, because I currently mostly just do my polling weighting in an Excel sheet, which is how the math error occurred. Everything's in an Excel spreadsheet here. I will not explain or tab to anything else because I don't want to show you my methods. Whoops. That was fine to tab to, by the way. Oh, shit. Well, doesn't matter. We digress. I just wanted to tab over. It doesn't matter. So the one on the right is the one I did with is the sample conducted through my normal recruiting methods. And it's 83 people. The one to the right includes people recruited through this outreach. And it's 134 people. I recruited 51 people through running ad campaigns. Which I will just note, wow, that's really effective. I understand internet advertising now because I basically spend like $60 and I got 51 people to fill out a survey. That's pretty good, actually. Yeah, technically, if you do IVR calling, it's way cheaper, but I don't have the time, effort, or resource to set up an IVR call center. Like, it's not that expensive to do it once you do it, but like, I'm a guy in my house, so point stands. Pretty impressed by that, actually. But that causes a big difference, and you can kind of see here. And I'll compare this more properly in a moment. But what I think happened is I probably got a more accurate sample of how Nova Scotians at large felt by doing this. But I think I ended up getting a lot of people who didn't or weren't going to vote. Whereas my normal recruiting methods, I'm pretty sure that actually represents the people who will vote. So I think going forward, I'm not going to try these recruitment efforts to try to using like advertising or anything like that to boost response rates. It does work to boost response rates, but I think it changed the sample in a way that it no longer is as good a sample. And the one last thing I will just mention, I had literally no greens respond to my poll, so my green number here is basically just assuming that the 2021 Greens are voting again for Green, which is a very dubious assumption, but I had to assume something. Like, they're going to be Green votes. Obviously, there was 0.8%. Now, let's compare across the board here. One second, I will just make some room because I just realized it was not coming across well on the screen. Sorry for that. My editing is pretty lackluster. So there's a lot of chaos here. So we have the published version of my model, and perfectly fine to grade me on that in the comments below or any other future references. Feel free. I do not mention unpublished stuff because I want you to grade me on that. I'm just saying that this is also a thing I did. It's just full disclosure. So now, for those of you who are familiar and look at my YouTube community tab, I did mention that there were polls out that I did not have time to go through and publish an update on the 26th because I was planning on doing it on my laptop at my parents' house when I was in town, but I could not do that. I do not have Python installed on my laptop, and I did not have time to install Python on my laptop. We're talking like I had like 30 minutes to do this, and it would take too long. It would take about 30 minutes to actually properly do the work I wanted to do anyways. Installing Python wasn't going to happen. But when I do run those numbers, and I add those last polls that I missed, as you can see here, it improves the mean squared error of my poll, but it does reduce the seed hit rate. It basically, the difference here, and the reason I don't have a map for this, is it's essentially the exact same as this map, but Fairview Clayton Park is PC. That's the only difference. So my seed hit rate's a little lower, but my popular vote accuracy is higher. And as we see here, though, this is how the polling average did. The polling average was pretty decent in this election. It's actually better than what I published, which is amusing. But it is what it is. Sometimes happens. A part of that is, again, just the polls. I don't think the polls... the polls were actually more accurately reflecting the PC vote share on average than my model was because I was underestimating the PCs. Like, I have things built into my model to try to actually predict turnouts and stuff like that. I was predicting a higher turnout, basically. And the turnout was lower, and the PCs actually voted, and the other people did not. But otherwise, here, we kind of see the same deal. Like, my polling was either really good or bad, depending on if you want to give me credit or not for stuff I did not publish. Or if you want to give me credit for correcting errors in something I did publish. But onto the regionals, I did pretty solid in the South Shore and the published, slightly worse in the unpublished because just the last little bit of polls changed some math around, like with the Liberals and stuff. My actual polling, especially if you give me credit for the ones I did not publish and or the one I corrected, was a lot better than my model, which is amusing. In Annapolis Valley, I did pretty solid across everything. So nothing really to say there. I pretty much did that one pretty well. Fundy Northeast, there was a pretty big miss on my part. I really, really underestimated the PCs in this region to like a very remarkable degree, especially in the published version of it. I ended up being off by nearly 10 points. That's pretty big miss. I'm not entirely sure how I managed to miss this big, but I did. But that happens to some regionals. Things like that are just, they occur. Interestingly enough, my corrected poll and my unpublished poll were actually worse than the one I published, which is amusing. So it be like that sometimes. In North Nova Scotia here, my unpublished model result was super accurate, like scarily accurate, which is pretty good. Everything else was pretty solid, though my published version of my polls, not great. Not terrible, but not great. Just to be for people at home, mean squared error is essentially you take the difference between, say, 71.8 and 71.6, you square it, then you add it to all the other ones. So there's 5 of them. Add all 5 of those errors up, then divide by 5. And I generally consider for a regional, under 5 is pretty good for mean squared error. For national, I try to be under, or for the province-wide result or the national-wide result, I try to be under 1. So all my stuff here is meh, but that happens. And for polls are usually going to have higher ones than models because obviously the model can do a lot of stuff polls cannot do. Polls are raw data, right? So for polls, something like 11 or 13 is not as bad as I would be if my model was 11 or 13. And this is true for every pollster, not just myself. Cape Breton, not super great. I had a pretty big miss here, about 10 points again. Even my unpublished polls not super good. Not the worst, but And then to finish, Halifax, I did pretty good. I have actually, all my seat hit rate is here, or seat misses are in Halifax County, but my popular vote is pretty solid, and my poll did okay. So that's kind of where we are there. If you want to give me credit for the unpublished stuff that is better than the published stuff, feel free. If you don't want to, don't. I'm just reporting what I did. And going forward, I'm planning on probably pushing out my polling dates and elections a little bit. So maybe like I'll start the polls in the second week of an election instead of the first week. And I'm only going to do my normal recruiting methods going forward. I'm not going to recruit via advertising or anything. Maybe if eventually I have the resources, I might put some telephone IVR polls data in there, but I currently do not have the resources for that, so that's going to be a future me problem. But it's still, I'm not sold on that. I might try it for like one election, but I still I have a feeling that my current methods of recruiting are actually superior. But we will see. Now, that brings us to the interesting part of the video, which I'm sure many of you have skipped to. What does this mean? What is the result of this going forward? So, first, the Liberals were decimated across the province. Let's see, can I make this a little bigger so it's easier to read? That's really slow. We're going to look up this instead. This is close enough. So the Liberals were decimated across the province. And the NDP basically only performed in the city of Halifax itself. And when I say the city of Halifax, I literally mean the city of Halifax. I don't mean the exurbs. I don't mean the suburbs. I mean the peninsula and downtown Dartmouth, pretty much. They have terrible everywhere else. Outside of that, like places such as Cape Breton Centre, Whitney Pier aren't even that strong of an end result for the Liberals. Did this thing load yet? This is even smaller. Okay, can zoom in. Cape Breton, Whitney Pier is not even a great result. Sackville, Cobequid's not a great result. Halifax, Armdale, and Fairview are pretty small wins. And it's worth noting, too, in a lot of these places, most of these ridings, especially the ones that the Liberals the NDP ended up flipping, they didn't gain voters. It's pretty much just Sackville, Cobequid where they gained voters. Every other riding, they've lost voters from 2021. They've lost about 9,000 to 10,000 across the province from 2021. That's quite a few votes. And that's pretty bad. Now, the Liberals, obviously, they didn't do any better. They got decimated. They lost about, something like 80,000 voters across the province. Terrible. Absolutely terrible result. They're down 2 seats. Sydney Memberto's not a particularly strongly held seat either. You could say arguably Timberley Prospect isn't, but because of the strength of Ian Rankin as a candidate, I think he's probably fine for now. He'll probably hold on going into 2028, 2032, regardless of what else happens. Sydney Memberto, though, would be at risk because it's a pretty narrow margin, and the incumbent lost. I'll put it this way: the incumbent at Sydney Memberto wildly underperformed polling or modeling, which is usually a bad sign. It's usually a bad sign, and he underperformed 2021 as well, which is, obviously, but still a bad sign. So this puts the PCs and Tim Houston in a very, very dominant position. It's kind of hard to even imagine where they go from here. How could they lose? It's hard to think of a path to victory for the other two parties. And I have been spending the last 2 weeks thinking about how do these other two parties challenge the PCs. And outside of something that could, in principle, happen, which is the PCs just collapsing, I don't see how it's possible. The PCs would need to collapse, fall apart, in full retreat. Tim Houston would have to have a terrible term for this to change. And I just don't see him having a terrible term. He might not fix all the problems in Nova Scotia, but we all have seen Ontario. In Ontario, Doug Ford's holding on by just being generic and average. If Houston can be even slightly above average, I'm not saying he has to be great. I'm not saying he has to be, super strong, such a good leader. If he's just slightly above average, he's probably going to hold on because he is such a remarkably devastating lead at this point in time. He won this election by about 107,000 votes across the province. And it's not even like he has any particular weaknesses. He won almost all of the Halifax suburbs. It's just Sackville Cobequid and Halifax Armdale, which are suburbs that he lost. I consider, you could say Fairview Clayton Park's a suburb, or you could say it's part of the core. It's kind of a weird spot where it's has a lot of traits of a core neighborhood, but also has a lot of traits of a suburban neighborhood. So that's a tricky one. And he won almost all the exurbs except Timberley Prospect. And Timberley Prospect, again, has just a remarkably strong Liberal candidate in it. So that's not it's saying that the Liberals are good in the exurbs. That's just Ian Rankin was a good candidate. So there's really not much to go on. So we'll start with the Liberals first. We'll start with the NDP first, because I think the NDP are more clear. I don't think after this result that Claudia Chender is going anywhere. She gained 3 seats. She technically gained net vote share, though she lost about 9 to 10,000 votes, depending on the current total. I haven't looked recently. Doesn't really matter. Let's say 9,000 to be generous. She lost 9,000 votes, which is substantial. But she gained 3 seats in net vote share. So she's probably not going anywhere, which means the NDP has no chance. Claudia Chender does not play well outside of Halifax. I mean, again, you can just look at this across the province. She lost voters. She only gained Fairview Clayton Park and Halifax Armdale because the Liberals imploded. And she only gained Sackville Cobequid because the PCs ran a bad candidate and the NDP ran a good candidate. Now you could say picking a good candidate says something to her leadership. And sure, I'll give you that one. It does say something to the leadership. But the key here, and I think this is a pretty important thing to emphasize, is it wasn't the policy platform of the NDP at all. All of these things were outside of the policy positions advanced by the NDP. These are things that happened to the NDP, not things that the NDP did themselves because of their central campaign. And that's really going to hold them back going forward. I don't really see a path with the NDP under the current leadership going anywhere at all. They ran a campaign on almost exclusively urban issues and a lot on social issues, but not social issues that appeal to the rest of the province. Going on about how we need to have more access to surgical abortions is not a winning issue in rural Nova Scotia. First off, the rural Nova Scotia is quite socially conservative, so that's already turning them off. But even more importantly than that, that's just not an issue that anyone cares about. That's not a high priority issue, and it really does turn people off to talk about something like that. It's not a winning issue anywhere. I've talked about this in the US. I've talked about this here. Those are not winning issues. I don't care if you're blue, if you're red, what party you stand for, what ideology you represent. It's not a winning issue to talk about it. People do not want to hear it, for the most part. And the people who do care about that issue, you can signal to in a much easier and simple method. But the NDP, they're in a position where I don't see a path. They could gain votes next election if everything goes well, but it's very unlikely they'll gain seats. And with that, we'll jump into the Liberals, because the Liberals are going to touch on things. So I think this is going to be the main thing that determines 2028. So at this time, there has been 3 names and a half that I've seen circled around for the next NSLP leader. Now, will these 3/3.5 people actually run? Who knows? But these are 3.5 names I've seen. Ian Rankin, because everyone's been like, oh, he did a lot better in 2021, and he did really well in his seat, and he's one of the only 2 current MLAs. So let's give him a shot again. I've seen people say Sean Fraser. Basically, high-profile cabinet minister, talks well. From the rural Nova Scotia, maybe he has some appeal there. Similar idea, I've seen Cody Blois from King's Hants. He's not as high profile, but he has some of the other benefits that Sean Fraser has. And the local support he might have in the Annapolis Valley might actually be useful, whereas the local support Sean Fraser has in Pictou County and Antigonish area probably isn't going to get anything. We'll demonstrate that. And the last name, I only say this is a half because it seems very unlikely to me that he would do this, but the other name I've seen circled is Andy Fillmore. Now, the reason I don't think Andy Fillmore would actually jump on this is he literally just got elected mayor, and I do not see him resigning the mayor of Halifax role within the year of getting elected to the mayor of Halifax. I just don't see that happening. But in principle, maybe he could bring some support out in Halifax region that the Liberals are lacking. So he might not be a terrible leader in that respect. I just don't think he'd actually run for it. Now, for the other 3, I did actually create some scenarios. And I will just caveat this. Part of how I generated these scenarios is I'm assuming, and this is a very bold assumption, that there's 2 big assumptions. One, people who voted for these parties in 2024 are going to vote for them again, i.e. there's no big scandals, there's no collapse of the PCs. They're not going to net lose 2024 voters. They might lose some to Liberals or the NDP, but they'll gain some back. And that won't have a net change. That's assumption 1. And assumption 2 is that the people who didn't vote can be turned out to vote again. And that brings us to a couple scenarios. So my first scenario here is Ian Rankin as a leader. And I think actually Ian Rankin has the best shot of doing anything. I don't think he has any chance of winning, as we can see in this example here, but I think this is the best chance. So again, this is assuming turnout jumps massively, and a lot of the people who did not vote in 2024, but did vote in 2021, turn out again, and some other people turn out. So in this regard, Houston is going to gain, and according to projection, 7,000 voters, but the Liberals will gain about 70,000 and the NDP about 14. This will also likely mean that Claudia Chinder stays on, even though she's going to lose seats. And I did make a mistake here. That should be 9, and she should be losing 3. But I have this map. This is what, roughly speaking, I think this map looks like. Now, I posted this on Twitter earlier in the week, and people have rightly pointed out that there is some possible errors in this. And when I say errors, I more mean that some of the seats are probably not going to project like this. Like, for example, I have Sackville-Cobequid going PC. It might say NDP. Places like Hammonds Plains Road might go Liberal in this scenario. Or in some places, such as like Bedford Basin, right here, that might stay PC. Like, there's going to be some noise on this, because the way I'm projecting this is not actually super accurate. It's not super precise. It's just a general idea. So this is kind of how I see Ian Rankin 2.0 going. Houston still wins a majority, but it's reduced. The Liberals are back to being the clear main opposition party, and they have some prospects going forward into 2032, but not a lot. They have places like King South, Clare, Sackville-Uniacke, Hammonds Plains Road, Sackville-Cobequid, and Dartmouth East as easy places to try to gain some more ground, but that only is about 5 seats. So getting above 20 is going to be hard. It's not impossible, but it's going to require probably Houston to either make a mistake or people just wanting a different government, being tired of the Houston government. But this would kind of rebound the Liberals back to almost where they were after 2021. So not a great showing by any means, but not a terrible showing. A better showing than what we just saw. And then our next one here, I have with Sean Fraser. I did correct my math mistake on the NDP seats here. So I think this would be actually a lower turnout election than with Ian Rankin as the leader. So the PCs are only gaining about 5,000 votes. The NDP is only getting about 6,000 votes. But the Liberals are gaining, again, roughly in the realm of 56,000 or 55,000 new voters. And this would put the election pretty close to 2021 absolute turnout numbers. But the big difference here being the PCs have gained a bunch of voters from the Liberals, and some from the NDP, and some from new voters. So it would not be perfect by any means. Map-wise, and yes, the NDP Liberals are gaining about 6 seats again, but it's still a solid majority for Houston. Apologies. So here the main difference is the Liberals are doing worse in the Halifax suburbs and exurbs area. They gain it back Bedford South, Clayton Park West, Halifax Armdale. Not terrible, but that's low-hanging fruit. They regain Annapolis and Yarmouth. Again, not terrible, but probably low-hanging fruit. And they gain Kings South this time, and that's only because I think turnout's lower. The higher turnout actually benefits the PCs in Kings South. Like, the turnout's still up from 2024, but in this projection, the Liberal turnout is higher. Like, there's a big surge in Liberal turnout without much of an increase in PC turnout, so that's how that happens. Fraser does a lot better in North Nova Scotia, but because the PCs do so well in North Nova Scotia, that doesn't change anything. It's irrelevant. It's noise, you could say. And the final one I have is Cody Blois here. I don't actually have a copyright-free picture of Cody Blois that I could find, one on Wikipedia. So he doesn't have a picture, but same deal here. Very similar story. Turnout's ever so slightly higher in this particular one, just because I think the local bias effect of Cody Blois being from the Annapolis Valley region, like Hants County, Kings County area, because that's where he was MP for. I think it actually is going to matter more, so it's going to make turnout slightly higher in this election. And it's going to make people like the PC turn out a little higher as well. And then we kind of get this kind of map. Pretty much the same map of this in the city of Halifax and the rest in North Nova Scotia. In the Annapolis Valley region, obviously Annapolis is very strongly switching Kings South and Hants West move, though he does ultimately lose Hants East, where he's running, and still decisively loses this election. And that's kind of where we are in my mind. There is really no clear path to me for any of the obvious frontrunners without either the Liberals changing their platform substantially, the NDP changing their platform substantially, or the PCs just doing a bad job. And the key with the PCs doing a bad job is it doesn't matter if the NDP or the Liberal voters think the PC is doing a bad job. The PC voters have to think Houston is doing a bad job. The 187,000 people who just voted for him have to believe he sucks. Or some of them have to believe, some substantial portion have to believe he's doing a bad job for this to really change anything. But if that doesn't happen, I think he cruises pretty easily at this stage to re-election in 2028. Or possibly early if he decides to call another snap election. There's just really no... The geography of Nova Scotia makes it very difficult for the opposition parties to win. It's kind of, in a sense, like Saskatchewan at this stage. Now the Liberals have been wiped out of rural Nova Scotia. In Saskatchewan, the SKP can win by default just by winning the small towns and the rurals. And in Nova Scotia, you have the same thing. There's 55 seats, 33 of them are outside of Halifax County. And even inside Halifax County, like, can you really call the Eastern Shore here the same thing as Halifax Needham? No, you can't. Like, they're completely different places. So even inside Halifax, the number of ridings that are actually very dense are quite low. Like, yeah, Halifax is a bigger city by population than, say, Saskatoon or Regina. But Saskatoon and Regina seem to be more urban, in a sense, than Halifax is. There's really only like 12, maybe 13, like, very urban ridings in Halifax. The rest of them are very suburban or complete exurbs. Like, you can't look at Fall River, Waverley area and say, aha, not an exurb. If you've ever driven through there, you know that's preposterous. Or, aha, Purcell's Cove, that's a suburb. No, it's not. No. So a lot of this stuff, it just doesn't, there's very little path here. And what that means is to win this, like, urban core here, which is roughly what I'm circling here, and maybe you could push into Coal Harbor, maybe you could push into Dartmouth East. Winning that core is challenging, as the PCs obviously have appeal in that core already. But even if they don't have appeal in that core, you still have to win that core and then win a lot of other stuff. You win that core. Let's say the NDP wins the core of Halifax. They win Halifax. They win Clayton Park. They win Bedford. They win Sackville-Cobequid. They win Dartmouth and Coal Harbor. How many seats is that? That's 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. That's 14 seats. And that's the most urban parts of Halifax County. That's the most urban parts of the province. Okay, let's say they win Cape Breton, Whitney, Pier, and Sydney Memberto 2. Okay, you're at 16 seats. 16. There's 39 other seats in the entire province, and none of them are particularly urban. The next most urban seat might be, like, Pictou Centre, maybe Truro. Maybe you could say it's King South. Okay, but those... First off, as Tim Houston is leader, I don't think Pictou Centre's in play. End of story. Especially versus a Halifax-based NDP leader or a Halifax-based Liberal. Truro's trending the opposite direction. It's trending conservative. So that's not meaningful. And again, when we're saying Truro is quote-unquote urban, Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook area, that's like 10,000 people. Like, we are borderline talking about this being an urban area. Maybe if we're really generous and we include all this other stuff, I think it's like 14,000 people is the population of this riding. Maybe it's like 15. But, like, really, 15, like, that's not a lot of people. It's not. King South is a very similar sense. Like, yeah, Kentville's a decently sized town. Yeah, there's 16,000 electors in Truro. I just double checked. King Kentville's a good sized town. Wolfville's a good sized town. New Minas is a good sized town. Yeah, absolutely. You put all those together, and you're still looking at probably in the realm of like 10,000 people. And they're in small towns. Like, it's not 10,000 people. The 10,000 people in King South is not like, say, the 15,000 people in Fairview Clayton Park. And then you also have to consider the rest of the population of King South is more farming, more rural, or very, very small towns. Like, I can't think of all of them off my head, but there's other small towns there. I'm just blanking. Like, no, I'm blanking. Sorry about that, people in King South. And again, there's not much. It's pretty narrow, and okay, maybe you really want to cast an net broad, and you think about like Bridgewater over here, Bridgewater, Lunenburg. You're looking at like 10, 15,000 people in a small town. Okay. Yarmouth is only like 6,000 people in a small town. The rest of it's rural. There's not a lot of play here. The only other quote-unquote urban area that's not part of Halifax County would be your part of East Hants here. But East Hants, the Enfield to like Milford part of East Hants, roughly speaking, like 6, 7, 8,000 people, depending on exactly who you want to count in this stretch, is extremely ex-urban. It's swinging very right. There is really no obvious way a urbanite NDP is going to win that. You look at the Liberals, and you have a similar challenge, trying to win the urban issues in Halifax and then trying to win the rural issues in the rest of the province. It's not impossible, but it's a non-trivial task. And I really think we're going to be in a situation, barring the PCs tremendously screwing up, that they're going to just win by default for a while. I would not entirely be surprised if the PCs, probably won't be Tim Houston himself, he'll probably retire sometime after 2028 re-election. Maybe he'll retire in like 2030 or something. But I would not be surprised if someone running the PCs, the PCs govern for the next 16 years. Barring them making a meaningful mistake, the geography and the demographics of the province just do not play well with the two opposition parties and their current platforms and their current leadership hopefuls. Again, the Liberals, the NDP could change, or the PCs could screw up and that would change things. I'm not saying it's guaranteed 16 years locked in, but barring the Liberals or the NDP changing significantly, or barring Houston and or the PCs screwing up significantly, the math is just so against the Liberals, the NDP. Even if they merged together, the math is really against them. Okay, let's say in like some preposterous world, the most absurd timeline, you merge the NDP and the Liberals, okay? And they win all of the meaningful winnable parts of Halifax. So they have Ian Rankin still. They win like Hammonds Plain, Sackville Uniacke, as well as like the core Preston area. So you throw all that, and let's say they can win. Well, that's probably all they can meaningfully win right now, presently in Halifax. That's 4 more seats. So they're at 18 in Halifax area. They win King South. They win Lunenburg. They win Annapolis. They win Sydney Membertou, and they win Cape Breton Whitney Pier. Huzzah! They're doing so good. They're at 23 seats. 23 seats. So they win Yarmouth, they're at 24. And now you're running into a situation of what else do you win? Maybe they can win back Glace Bay Dominion. 25. Maybe they can pull out a surprise win and take back Halifax Atlantic. Maybe they can put a surprise win and win Fall River Waverley, 27. Like, we're already pushing the bounds of what is reasonable, and we're only getting around 27. Okay, maybe they don't win Halifax Waverley, maybe they don't win Halifax Atlantic. But let's say they win Kings North and West Hants. You're in the same situation. You're at 27. They would need to win, say, Halifax Atlantic, West Hants, and Fall River Waverley to pull out the narrowest majority. And if you merge the NDP and the Liberals, first off, the Nova Scotia Liberals are closer to the PCs than they are to the NDP. But second, even if you did this, you're going to lose a lot of voters because, again, the Nova Scotia Liberals are closer to the PCs. A lot of rural Nova Scotia Liberal voters in places like West Hants, in places like Annapolis, in places like Yarmouth, are not going to vote for the NDP. They won't. You'll probably end up getting a situation, if you do this, where the PCs are winning like 60-65% of the vote to the NDP languishing in the 30s. It's just I don't really see a path at all. The question for the next decade in my mind, barring again the PC screwing up or the opposition dramatically changing, the only thing that's going to matter here is who's going to be the opposition leader and who's going to be yelling at the PCs for any mistakes they do make. But with that, I bid you guys adieu, and I will see you next week with something else.